Basically means your heart and lungs can take the OR, and you're assuring the surgeon more or less na there will be little medical morbidities during the procedure. So syempre nagpapanik ako, pero kalmado lang ako. So what did you do? What did you say? Ay, doktora, inaway ko sila. Then I went there, hindi ko tingnan yung patient at sinulat ko doon. The patient is already cleared, CP cleared by cardio. The patient may undergo OR, cleared from endocrine standpoint. Gusto ko mamatay. So, syempre you begin by, at that time kasi mahaba pa pasensya ko, ngayon hindi na. Noon mahaba pa pasensya ko, so sabi ko, ganito. Do you know why that patient is being referred for endocrine clearance? Nagbasa ka ba? Hindi po, doktor. Kasi we have a pre-operative book. Bread and butter namin yung mag-clear for surgery, whether you're a general internist or a subspecialist. So, dapat marunong ka mag-clear ng all types of medically affected patients. And meron kaming chapter on how to clear an endocrine patient, how to clear a cardio patient, how to clear a renal patient, Siyempre, kinalimutan ko na lahat yun kasi endocrine dapat, sa CP na lang kaya kong gawin. The others I refer to the subspec. But at least that you should know when to refer. Sabi ko sa kanya, you didn't treat. So, ganito na lang. Siyempre kasi mahaba pa pasensya ko nun. Ganito na lang. What are the hormones that your adrenal secretes? Kasi pag masabi mo yun sa akin, tapos alam mo kung anong ginagawa ng hormones na yun, you'll be able to work out for yourself why that patient is being referred to you for clearance. And what would happen if he has hypersecretion of one of those hormones and you undergo OR without adequate preparation? Sige, go. I-name mo sa akin yung mga alam mo lang na hormones from the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Wala siyang masagot. Oh. Third year medical resident siya. Super masipag siya. And any first year medical student should be able to answer this question. Student, hindi niya masagot. And I cannot use the excuse of physiology was so far away. Kasi basic stock knowledge to. Diba? And hindi niya man lang man-name yun. And because of that, naggalit ako. Naggalit ako. More on that later. Okay. So that, being diligent medical students, unlike that medicine resident, you read so that you will be able to do the following with my help by the end of the lecture. First, to enumerate the hormones of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Yan lang ang sagot na hinihingi ko sa kanya. Okay. To discuss the physiology of the above hormones in terms of everything that's listed on the board. And to explain the clinical presentation of disorders resulting from abnormalities in adrenal hormones, specifically these which are listed on the board. Based on those objectives, I'll just flash this outline so you know where we're going and how. So first, we'll have a brief overview of the adrenal gland. I'll then proceed to discuss the hormones of the adrenal cortex. I'll discuss first your glucocorticoids and adrenal androgens, how they're synthesized, how they're transported in the plasma, and their metabolism. I'll discuss the regulation of their secretion and synthesis, as well as their effects and actions. I'll then move on to your mineralocorticoids. We'll discuss their biosynthesis and metabolism, regulation, as well as their effects. I'll then discuss disorders involving hormones of your adrenal cortex. These disorders include your Cushing's syndrome, adrenal insufficiency or Addison's disease, CAH or congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and hyperaldosteronism. From the cortex, I'll move on to the medulla. So I'll discuss your catecholamines, their biosynthesis and secretion, degradation, receptors, and their effects. And we'll discuss one disorder involving excess catecholamine production. This is your pheochromocytoma. So this is your adrenal gland. You have one on top of each kidney. The other name is suprarenal gland. So it measures up. It weighs about 4 grams each and is found retroperitoneally. So if enlarge that adrenal gland here, this picture is from boron. It is surrounded by a capsule. And within the capsule, you have an outer cortex and an inner medulla. Just like your pituitary, the anterior and the posterior, which are derived from different embryological origins and hence function differently, so do your cortex and medulla. Your cortex is derived from the mesoderm, while your medulla is derived from neural crest cells, which migrate to fuse with the developing mesoderm or cortex. Because of the different embryological origins, therefore, you should begin to suspect that the way that these two areas function, your cortex and medulla, the way that they function and are regulated are very different. If we enlarge this adrenal gland and draw it schematically like this, we'll further see that the outer cortex is further subdivided into three zones. You have your glomerulosa, your fasciculata, and reticularis from the outer to the inner. Your zona glomerulosa is responsible for synthesizing and secreting your mineralocorticoids, predominant one of which is your aldosterone. Both your fasciculata and reticularis are responsible for synthesizing and secreting your glucocorticoids and adrenal androgens. Now, in PGH, when we were first year, we would memorize the layers and their products like this. So from the outer to the inner, GFR, tapos salt, sugar, sex. As we would remember it that way. However, even if yung G sa salt is correct, meaning that the glomerulosa produces the mineralocorticoids, yung F and R na sugar and sex is not entirely true because yung fasciculata and reticularis are both capable of synthesizing and secreting your glucocorticoids and adrenal androgens. Now, some books will still say that yung fasciculata is the one which is responsible for the glucocorticoids, but the reality is the biosynthetic enzymes for the production of your glucocorticoids and adrenal androgens are found in both of these layers. So kahit man GFR, salt, sugar, sex, medyo totoo. But both the fasciculata and reticularis both synthesize and secrete your glucocorticoids and adrenal androgens. Inside the adrenal cortex, you have the inner to the cortex, you have the inner medulla. You have your endocrine cells there, which are called your chromaffin cells, which are specialized postganglionic sympathetic neurons, and they are capable of synthesizing and secreting your catecholamines. So I'll discuss the adrenal cortex first. Specifically, I'll discuss the products of the fasciculata and reticularis layers, which, as aforementioned, are the glucocorticoids and the adrenal androgens. So when we refer to adrenal corticosteroids, these are the steroid hormones produced by your adrenal cortex. All adrenal corticosteroids are synthesized from cholesterol, of which you have two sources. You have the LDL cholesterol, which is endocytosed by your LDL receptor as a source. And the other source is to form cholesterol de novo from acetate. Between these two sources, however, it is the LDL cholesterol, which is qualitatively and quantitatively the more important source of cholesterol for the formation of your adrenal corticosteroids. 80% of your adrenal corticosteroids cholesterol, which is the precursor, is derived from LDL. I will again reiterate, there is no storage pool for any steroid hormone, and hence there's no storage pool for cortisol. Every time you need it, you will have to synthesize it first. And if you recall the HPA axis or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal gland axis, in this case, the stimulator for the synthesis and secretion of cortisol will be ACTH. You will have to wait for ACTH to stimulate this adrenal cortex to synthesize first the cortisol before it is secreted. Biochem, sorry, relax. Okay. So, this shows the biosynthetic pathway of your adrenal cortex. Paano ba siyang Okay, so the biosynthesis of your corticosteroids, all of them, adrenal corticosteroids are shown on the board. This is again taken from boron. So, the synthesis of your adrenal corticosteroids begins with your cholesterol, most of which is derived from your LDL. The biosynthetic pathways for all of your adrenal corticosteroids involve the use of cytochrome P450 enzymes, except for one enzyme, which is your 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which is not a cytochrome P450 enzyme. The cytochrome P450 enzymes are found either in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum or in the mitochondria. Therefore, the byproducts or intermediate products are actually being shunted between these two organelles. So the cholesterol, of course, is found in the cytoplasm. It needs to be acted upon by an enzyme known as your SCC enzyme or your Side chain cleavage enzyme, also known as your 2022 desmolase. Okay. This is the rate limiting enzyme, which catalyzes the conversion of your cholesterol to the pregnenolone. This is the rate limiting step and is a major site of action of your ACTH action. So your ACTH regulates the activity of your SEC enzyme, which catalyzes this rate limiting step of conversion from cholesterol to pregnenolone. Notice that the SEC enzyme for this to happen is found in the mitochondrion, and therefore you will have to transport your cholesterol to inside the mitochondrion for the SEC to cleave it or transform it to the pregnenolone. And therefore, you need a transport protein to transport this cholesterol to the mitochondrion. This is accomplished by your STAR protein or steroidogenic acute regulatory protein, which mediates the transfer of your cholesterol from the cytoplasm to the inner mitochondrial membrane. I mentioned this STAR because you have some patients who, I'm sure from biochemistry you've realized that in any biosynthetic or metabolic pathway, if you have enzymes, which are proteins, if you have a defect, genetic defect involving one of these proteins, nagkaloko-loko na itong biosynthetic pathway na to. So, we mentioned this STAR. If you have a deficiency or lack of this STAR protein, what will happen? You just have cholesterol accumulating in the cytoplasm. It cannot enter the mitochondria, and because of this, you do not form cortisol, aldosterone, or your adrenal androgens. So the adrenal insufficiency. But aside from that, their adrenal glands are large and lipid-laden. Because nga, naiipit na lang hanggang cholesterol, yung cholesterol doon in the cytoplasm. Okay. So, in converting your, from cholesterol converted via SEC to your pregnenolone, from pregnenolone, we will now form your cortisol. How do we do this? Via the series of enzymes that we will mention now. So first, your pregnenolone is converted to your progesterone via, again, your 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Progesterone is converted via your 17-alpha hydroxylase to your 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone. 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone, in turn, is converted by your 21 alpha hydroxylase to your 21 deoxycortisol, which is then converted via your 11-beta hydroxylase to your cortisol. If you look at this biosynthetic pathway, that's not the only pathway by which you can form cortisol from pregnenolone. I'll show you another pathway. Pregnenolone can be converted by your 17-alpha hydroxylase to your 17-alpha hydroxypregnenolone, which in turn is converted by your 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase to your 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone, which in turn again is converted by your 21-alpha hydroxylase to your 21 deoxycortisol, which again is converted by your 11-beta hydroxylase to your cortisol. I place these two pathways on the board. The red arrows show the common pathway. Then you have two pathways, the pink pathway, the pathway denoted by the pink arrows, and the pathway denoted by the blue arrows. If you read Boron or Williams, Boron and Williams say that the primary predominant pathway is the one shown in pink. If you read Greenspan will say that the predominant pathway is the blue pathway and that the pink is but an alternative pathway. So depending on which book you read, so kung Boron or Williams' textbook of endocrinology, the primary pathway is the pink pathway with another alternative pathway to cortisol synthesis through the blue pathway. Pag Greenspan, yung binasa natin baliktad, the primary pathway is the blue pathway and the pink one is the alternative pathway. Promise, hindi ko tatanungin which is primary or alternative, but you need to know that there are two pathways by which you can form cortisol from pregnenolone. Now, when you form pregnenolone to cortisol, what do you notice? The 17-alpha hydroxylase enzyme is important. Whether you use the pink or the blue pathway, if you don't have the 17-alpha hydroxylase, there's no way you can reach cortisol, right? And this is actually the reason why cortisol is formed in both the reticularis and fasciculatal layers and not in the glomerulosa. The 17-alpha hydroxylase enzyme is found substantially in the fasciculata and reticularis layers, but not in the glomerulosa. And for this reason, therefore, your FNR produce your cortisol. Once secreted, your cortisol is a steroid hormone. So most of it is actually bound to a carrier protein. Most of it, 75 to 80%, is bound to your CBG, or your corticosteroid binding globulin, also known as your transcortin. 15% is bound to your albumin, and only 5 to 10% is found free in the plasma, which again is the biologically active form of cortisol. I'd also like to discuss metabolism of your cortisol. Once it's done, what it's supposed to do at its target cells, there must be a way by which we can metabolize and degrade cortisol so that we can terminate cortisol action. So the main sites of degradation of your cortisol is at your liver and your kidneys. So in your kidneys, your cortisol is converted to your cortisone via your type 2 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Both your cortisol and cortisone are serially degraded and conjugated into glucuronides, which are then excreted into your urine. 75% of the degraded cortisol is excreted via the urine. 25%, di ba, meron sa liver na degradation. 25% is excreted through the bile and excreted through the feces. So I flash again the HPA axis, which we discussed during the pituitary lecture. So in the regulation of cortisol secretion, this is a three-tiered axis again. Your hypothalamus secretes your CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the corticotropes of your anterior pituitary to synthesize and secrete your ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin, which then stimulates your adrenal cortex, specifically the F and the R layers, to produce and secrete your cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, such that stress stimulates this entire pathway. Sleep, transitioning from the sleep to wake cycle, also stimulates ACTH and CRH, and hence cortisol secretion and synthesis. ADH, just like CRH, also stimulates ACTH secretion and hence cortisol synthesis and secretion. On the other hand, brain natriuretic peptide inhibits ACTH secretion and hence cortisol synthesis and secretion as well. Cortisol can exert long-loop negative feedback at the level of your pituitary and hypothalamus, such that when you have high cortisol, this inhibits both ACTH and CRH secretion. I'd like to focus on that ACTH. CRH stimulates your anterior pituitary to release ACTH. And ACTH is released and reaches your adrenal cortex. And there, your ACTH will bind to the adrenocortical cell via a G-protein-coupled enzyme, a G-protein-coupled receptor, which is your melanocortin 2, which acts via your adenylyl cyclase, making use of cyclic AMP as a effector. Now, binding of your ACTH to its G-protein-coupled receptor on the adrenal cortical cell induces increased activity of various enzymes as well as the synthesis of several enzymes. If you look back to the biosynthetic pathway of your cortisol, once ACTH binds to its G-protein-coupled receptor in the adrenal cortex, immediately it will increase activity of various proteins and enzymes involved in that biosynthetic pathway. Subsequently, it will increase synthesis of the enzymes and proteins involved in the biosynthetic pathway by increasing gene transcription and hence protein synthesis of these key enzymes and proteins. In the long term, if ACTH is still elevated and it remains bound to the ACTH receptor, it will cause an increase in size, function, and complexity of the organelles of the adrenal cortex, and will also increase the size and number of the cells in the adrenal cortex as well. This, of course, only happens if the ACTH is increased for a long time. I flashed